Good evening. It's Sunday, the 12th of October. I'm Tony Goldstone, and I just wanted to update you on some bits in the news this week on taxation and pension tax, and also where we're up to on my modeler. So, just starting with the news, we all wake up this morning to some of the usual pre budget speculation that's in certain parts of the media, and all the usual sorts of stories that there's going to be a pension tax raid, similar in the Sunday Telegraph, speculating about how they're going to fill black holes to pay for the current budget deficit. And I think the main take home message from my perspective is please don't read too much into it. I try not to comment too much on this kind of kite flying that is done every year, and certainly every year that I can remember in the last decade, for example, have talked about things like axing the tax-free lump sum or reducing the tax-free lump sum. And so I think it's really important for people not to act on speculation, because you know some of those decisions will of course potentially be irreversible, and they may not be in your best interest. So generally speaking, you should try and make decisions based on the law and taxation that it's at currently. Sure, you might want to defer some decisions, like do you put extra into a SIP, for example, until after the budget rather than before the budget, because you can do that at any time during the current tax year. But I wouldn't be making any major decisions based on whatever's in the Daily Telegraph or the Express, for example, because that can be very dangerous and not necessarily in your best interest. Now, there was another story which I commented on Twitter. Really good story from Bradley Young at Sky News, and looking in detail at the 100k tax trap. And the 100k tax trap is something that I've talked about a lot and put a lot of stuff on social media about. Dan Needle as well is also really useful source for lots of information about the 100k tax trap and how people can get into kind of two bad effects from going over 100k. Firstly, there's this kind of strange situation in the tax system where the highest marginal rates are between 100k and then the additional rate threshold, which is just really silly that people earning just over 100k should be paying more tax than people that are earning much higher amounts. Doesn't really make sense to me. But because of some peculiarities around tax-free childcare as well, the penalties for going just over 100k can be really steep. And one of the things Bradley Young looks at is how he spoke to several people in his article that had mitigated that by just putting a large amount of money into a pension. So one of the examples he gave, somebody had put a full 60k into their pension. Now, this is where it gets a little bit trickier for those in the public sector, because those in the public sector don't know how much so-called headroom they've got after the NHS pension. So because we're not in a defined contribution pension, but we're in a defined benefit pension, that means you need to understand how much your benefits have gone up and then apply a complex formula. And you've got to do all of this in the context of a failing scheme administrator who has got pension admin that can be years out of date for some people who haven't got an RPSS yet, and that's tens of thousands probably. They've not got the last 10 years of data, so how they're meant to be making decisions about what headroom they've got to be able to put into a SIP to try and mitigate some of these problems, it's absolutely crazy. So I gave a bit of a preview in Twitter, so I'll just zoom into that a little bit, hopefully you can see that, that just showed people some of the tools that I'm working on to just try and help people navigate that. So rather than just use that kind of the IFS kind of example, which is two children in London in childcare, that's obviously very few people. What people need to understand is what this graph looks like for them, and also in the context of the NHS, and that can be quite difficult. So moving on to my modeler, lots of work going on in the background, being absolutely astounded by the amount of pre-registrations that are continuing to come in, giving a little preview of what's coming out in the completely free tool for personal use for registered users. It will only be registered users that will be getting their hands on these tools. It's not a spreadsheet anymore. It's an interactive tool, so you can come back to your figures later, etc., when you're close to the end of the tax year or into next tax year, for example. And if you want to get your hands on them, you're going to need to register at bit.ly/GPFT interest, or you can use that QR code, fill in this form, and then you will be invited to join that initial beta and be able to access at least this completely free tool. I think one of the things that struck me about the registrations, one of the things that I've been asking people is what schemes are people in, and historically the vast majority of the interest in the work that I've done around AA has been people in 1995 and 2015, but as I get more grey hair and there are younger consultants and GPs that are starting to worry about this, there are many more 2008 members, and so I've had hundreds of registrations from people who are in 2008/15, and in fact many also who are in 2015 only. So I have made the decision to add those to the modeler. So I just wanted to kind of give you a quick run through of where we're up to with the modeler. So this is the modeler here. So I just come out of edit mode. And as I said, we've now changed it so that it's going to cover people who are in the 1995 or 2008 schemes combined with 2015, or for those who are also just in 2015. This sort of modelling only works for people that have remained in the scheme for the whole period covered by the modeler. If you've been in and out, you need a ton more data than you'd be able to put into a tool like this to be able to accurately estimate things like annual allowance. So I'm afraid that is not going to be an option for you. So I just wanted to kind of go through some of the developments. So in the previous couple of videos, I've kind of shown what would happen for a member who was in the 2015 and 1995 schemes, which is still the majority of members. And for those, you're just going to need a recent TRS, and you can put in your pensionable pay from the 3 years that's on the 24-25 TRS, and you can also put in your work time equivalent, and you can also get your service from the 1995 or now the 08 scheme as well, and put that in there. You can put in added years. If you've got added years, there's a bit of a help section from there. You might need to get an 05 extract if you can't remember your contract details, and I've also just added disallowed days, because lots of people in the 15 or the 1995 or the 08 schemes will be affected by disallowed days in the 23-24 year. So if you want to include those in the calculations, you can say yes, and then just put in how many days you weren't paid for, and that will also take that into account. So that's the 1995 and 15 section, which, as I said, is most people. But if you're one of the hundreds of people that are in the 08 scheme, then you're going to need to use this page on your TRS, and this is the alternate benefits 2015 section, and that shows pensionable pay going all the way back to 2015, and then you can just transcribe that over to this section. So this was the previous section, and this is the new data that adds 15-16 all the way through to 21-22, and then that will allow you to compute annual allowance growth in the 2008 scheme. Now, pardon me, there's been some really interesting threads recently in social media over this weekend, for example, with lots of people really confused about 2008. So I've added a little bit just to try and explain to people how 2008 works. And so, for example, if we take this, this is a consultant, and we can see here that it's calculated the work time equivalent pays because this member is full-time, the full-time equivalent pay equals the actual pay. But you can see here, what I've also put on this line here is the percentage growth in their pensionable salary. So if you're in the 1995 scheme, now that people aren't getting any more service in 1995, because that all stopped in 2022 after McLeod, your growth basically is going to be entirely related to the percentage change in your salary relative to inflation. So you can see that this member is going to get stonking AA charges in 2024-25 and 25-26, because the allowable rise for 24-25 was 6.7% and it's 1.7% here. So that's going to equate to a big annual allowance charge. But reckonable pay is entirely different, because reckonable pay has two additional features. So firstly, it's an average of 3 years pay rather than a single pay, and that's kind of a good thing generally. So for example, if you get a big pay rise, it means that the rise from the pay rise is averaged over 3 years. But there's also a 10-year look back. Now, in the old world, kind of pre-Russia, Ukraine, etc., when inflation used to bumble along at 2% and not really move a great deal, almost always it was the case that the last 3 years were the reference period that we used. But if I just increase the amount of detail here that's shown for how this member's reckonable pay is calculated, you can see that it's all over the place. Yeah, so if we look at, in comparison, how reckonable pay has changed for this same member, it bears no relationship at all in general to how it changes for 1995 pay. So if you remember, there was that massive figure of 15.7 and that becomes 6.7, and then there's also comparative to inflation, very big figure of 7.5% for 25-6 becomes 2%. But the converse is true as well. So in some years, so for example in 23-24, where the 1995 growth was only 2%, but here it's 9%. So there's really very little relationship, and that's because of the 3-year averaging, and these are the 3-year averages of the inflation uplifted pay, but also it picks the best 3-year average. So for this member, had they been in 2008, 25-26 is the last 3 years, and also in 22-23 it's the last 3 years. But for 24-25 and 23-24, the reference period goes back 4 years and 3 years prior to those years. So if you're kind of comparing your growth to your mates or colleagues in your department, it becomes an impossibility, because lots of people say, well, you know, I'm part-time and colleagues who are much older than me, you know, haven't got this problem and I've got this problem this year. And it's because it's based on whole-time equivalent, not so it doesn't matter whether you're part-time or full-time, it's based on whole-time equivalent. And it may be that your pay has gone up a lot in a short period of time, or your reckonable pay has gone up involving all of this averaging, and it makes it very difficult to compare two colleagues to sense check whether or not it looks right. And that's kind of the whole raison d'etre of putting out tools like this, so people can actually sense check whether their growth makes sense, because unfortunately they don't bother to put on the pension saving statements simple things like what is your whole-time equivalent pensionable pay that they've used to calculate it. They just kind of put pathetic disclaimers saying that it's based on the information that your employer's provided, and if it's the mistake, it's the fault of the employer. Well, you know, if they're not showing you what that information is and what the figures are that they've used, it makes it very difficult for members to spot what's going on. So as I said last week, you just use your September payslip if you're in England, and I covered the other nations in last week's, or the one before, YouTube, but you just put in these two figures, and then that's going to give you a prediction for actual and work time equivalent pay, and then this is where you're going to get to. So this was the thing that was on the registration page, this little page here. So you can see, for example, for 3 years, the 3 relevant years that most people haven't got pension saving statements for, and including this year, which is the year that you can do something about. So you've got 23-24 still outstanding for many, 24-25, which was due in early October, but I'm sure lots of people still haven't got theirs, and 25-26 year is the current year, which isn't going to be payable till not this January, but the January after that. But it's the year that you might want to do something about. And then I've just added this kind of validation step here. So you can see, for example, if you've put in all the numbers correctly and there's no issues, you should be able to check those values on a TRS. You can see they match there exactly. So you know that it's all kind of making sense. Now, moving on to tapering, I covered this last week, so I'm not going to cover that again. But if you put in an estimation for taxable pay, you can get these really nice summaries. I'll just zoom out a bit if that works. Zoom out just a bit more. So you get these really nice summaries that you can also kind of use dynamically to see what happens. So I'm just going to change that from 2008 back to 1995 again. Oh, and sorry, and just to say, so as well as 95-15 and the new option of 2008 and 2015, there's also an option for those people that were excluded by McLeod, that have got a small amount of 2008 service, and then they were put in the 2015 scheme back in 2015, so they're now covered. And then for the people that registered that are 2015 only, they're now covered as well. So all of those kind of large groups, that's the vast majority of members, are covered by that. So as I said, you come down to this kind of nice summary view, but you can see the effect of how your taxable pay will cause things to change. So for example, if this member income is 198,500, the tax charge here is 12,000, and then they just go just over the taper slightly, and you can see that's gone up to 21,935. But because they're still in year, they can do something about it. For example, they could do a SIP, and then although their pension savings have gone up because of the private pension, their tax charge has gone down. So I've also developed this view as well, so this fits nicely on a printed page of A4, and you'll be emailed a PDF, so that prints out nicely and kind of just shows you a full summary. And then I've done quite a bit more work on these charts. So there's a really neat little table up here that shows what your tax charge is with no taper, with minimum tapering, and then maximum tapering. So this is a reproduction of this graph that I did based on the IFS graph last year, but rather than it being based on that year 13 consultant in the 24-25 tax year, that was a particularly brutal year, as many of you will find out when your brown envelope lands or when you do these calculations, because of the pay awards. That's only relevant to that person in that year, so that recreates these graphs, so it shows you what the depth of that taper cliff is, and then you can see what the effect is on your income and how that's going to change your net pay, and then also how you can mitigate that. So for example, if you could get your pay below 204,700, you could mitigate that, for example, by doing a gross pension payment of just over 5,000, and then that's dropped your charge right back down. So then the other new bits that I've been working on, so this was the bit that I previewed earlier in the week after that Sky News story, is this kind of IFS chart here, where they looked at the tax trap at 100k, and it showed that there's this ridiculous situation that people were better off earning all the way up to 134 than they were earning 99.9, but that's very specific for that individual, and it assumes that they had 2 young children and 40 hours of childcare, etc. And it all depends on the cost of your childcare, the age of your children, etc. So what I've done is, I'll just zoom out a bit again. So I've modelled that so you can look at your own marginal rates. So if we just come down to crossing that 100k barrier, so I'll just do the simple table. So this basically is a reproduction of this graph, but this is individual to these numbers. So you can put in what the total cost of your childcare is, the amount that you lose by falling over the 100k tax cliff. So for example, if you go from 30 to 15 hours, etc., what the total cost lost is, and then you can get a custom answer, and then you can look at what your marginal rates are. I've also added student loans in here, so loan type or postgraduate, for example, so people can look at a much more detailed look at what their net pay is, and if they want to see what the detail is, they can click on more, and then that shows all the tax at the different levels, student loan payments, annually or monthly, less childcare, and what you keep, and people can look at what their marginal rates are. So I've just been playing with Scotland today. I apologise to Scottish viewers to have to look at the horrendous increase in tax compared to English colleagues. So for example, if your pay was 99,900, and you can see that, you know, after a student loan your pay is 58,527, whereas if you were north of the border it's 61,854. South of the border 61,854 for exactly the same circumstances. But I'm still refining Scotland and going through all this detail. I just need to include it on these charts as well, because these charts still show the English values and not the higher marginal rates in Scotland. So this is kind of nearing the point where it's coming out. Just to re-emphasise, it's only going to be going to people who pre-registered. This growth bit that people are going to need to plan what they're going to do this year and have an idea of whether they've got an issue for last year and the year before, is going to be completely free, but you're only going to be able to get this if you register, and then your modeler is going to be locked to your email, and then you can it will allow you to email back PDFs, and then you can come back to them. So for example, if you're not quite sure what your taxable pay is going to be, obviously you'll be able to get a much better view of that nearer the end of the current tax year. So you can it'll be in your email, you can revisit it, click the link, it'll reopen it, and then you can give it a better estimate of what it's going to be nearer the time. So thanks for your attention once again, and if you're interested in getting hold of all of this stuff, please register at that email address. I just took that off prematurely. bit.ly/GPFT interest. Many thanks. Cheers.